Dear colleagues, I'm very glad to meet you here at our seminar. Not all the participants have come, but I think it's high time to start. So our today's seminar on academic writing is part of a bigger program of the Russian Science of the Russian International Affairs Council, which is named Global Science. Launched in late 2012, the program was aimed at improving the status of Russian research in the global knowledge market, and the need for this is quite apparent while looking at the position of the Russian science in world university rankings, and in general at the position of the Russian science in the world. This is to a great extent due to a very few publications made by Russian scholars, by Russian scientists in foreign scientific peer-reviewed journals. And our program has to do primarily with training young Russian scholars in the entire spectrum of skills needed for publications in foreign peer-reviewed journals. And a publication in an international scientific journal always was and is a sign of success, which can promote international recognition of particular scientists in the world. However, Russian scholars are faced with many difficulties in realizing this cherished dream, since such a successful publication requires much effort, and as part of this big program, the Russian International Affairs Council regular organizes workshops and seminars on different aspects of academic writing. And today's seminar, as usually, will be held by our prominent expert in academic writing, by Natalie. She has been teaching English language skills throughout Europe, Japan, the Pacific, the United States, etc. She has been teaching for over 20 years, specializing in academic writing, journal analysis, and technical writing. So I would like to give word to Natalie. Okay.
Okay, that sounds fine. Forgive me for using the microphone. You can hear me, but a couple of days ago I came down with a nasty cold, and I don't want to stress my voice. I had to do a 4-hour lecture yesterday, and interestingly enough, it was at a university. It was on the same topic, and they gave me 4 hours, and I have an hour and a half now, so I want to make the most of it. Everything I do and everything I say is based on 5 days of intensive, highly intensive training, which is all covered in the book. This is my old one. I was going to bring the revised edition, but the client yesterday bought all the copies, so they're gone, but there are more available in the States. I understand that today I'm to talk a bit about the research process, but primarily about argumentation. and how one argues in English. This is a huge topic because it involves knowing a number of other pieces and parts before we can even get to argumentation. But about the research project, I understand that you're all from various universities. And so I'd like you to just raise your hand if you come from a university that gives you access to all the journal articles in English that are published throughout Europe and the UK and the US and Canada and so on. How many of you are at a university that does that? 1, 2, 3? And you are from where? What?
It's the Free University in Berlin.
Okay.
Guimont University.
Which? Guimont. Okay. Yeah, I understand. Guimont and the Higher School of Economics are both doing this. Most of the other universities have not yet, according to my sources, which could be wrong. The problem is you can't do research and get published if you don't have access to the articles. Because in English, research is based on reading everything that's been published in your area, finding a research project from all of that reading that says, but nobody has looked at this aspect, or this part of it, or this element, and it has to be an important one. It can't be, nobody's looked at it. I can write about it because maybe nobody wrote about it because nobody cares about it. It has to be important, and it has to be new. And if you don't have access to the journals, how can you know? And that is the problem that I have found throughout Russia that's been just very deeply troubling to me, because I work all over Europe and in Asia. I'm in the Asian countries, the developed Asian countries, in Europe, in the States, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia. Everybody, research institutes and universities, everybody has access to all the journals. The university or the research institute subscribes to all of them. There are a number of ways of doing that, but it costs money. And my advice to rectors of universities when I've had the chance to talk to them is to say, put your money there. Because you can't do anything if you don't put your money there. Or at least pick your 2 biggest departments that you want to become famous for and put your money there. So I really feel sorry for you, and I can't help you that way with how to develop a research project if you can't get access to the journals. So maybe find a friend at Guimont, or find a friend at the Free University in Berlin, or find a friend, I'm serious, at the Higher School of Economics, and see if you can't use their email to get in and get your hands on these articles. If you can't read the articles, you can't do publishable research. It's as simple as that. And I hate to be, excuse me, I hate to be disappointing. I hate to be negative in this way, but it's the truth. And when I first worked in Russia 6 years ago, I was shocked that students didn't have access. How can you do research? It has to do with the history of Russian academic success that had nothing to do with getting published, and now it has everything to do with getting published. And if they're not helping you, how can you do it? So enough said. But I worry for you, and I wish you luck, and I hope that things will change. So, as to argumentation in English and how to argue, everything that I do is based on the linguistic theory of contrastive rhetoric. And this particular branch of linguistics was developed about 40 or 50 years ago among American teachers of writing to people from other languages. And they found that their very best students, who were the best at grammar, the best at conversation, the best at everything, turned in horrible pieces of writing. Their writing was terrible. And they would sit down with the student and say, look, this is what you do first, this is what you do second, and the student's next paper would be worse. And the teachers began talking to one another. And they discovered that when the student got nervous, the student said, but back in Russia, back in China, back in wherever, I was successful, so I have to go and do what I did there, and then it will work. So every time you try to think about what made you successful in your first language, essentially you screw up writing in the second language. And that's basically the point. When a language is a way of understanding the world, of framing the world, of giving words to what it finds in the world, some languages are more emotional, some languages are more structural. I mean, they're all different. And they all have different ways of organizing and presenting what they find in the world. So that every time you change languages, you have to change your complete way of looking at the world. And that, I think, makes you bigger, not smaller. But if you want to write in English, you can't think like a Russian. Just as if I want to write in Russian, I can't think like an American. Do you understand me? Because it won't work. It won't work. It turns out that thinking about what do I do in my native language completely ruins any possibility of success in the second language. And the whole point is that no language is any better or any worse than any other. They are simply all different. And much like a tragic actor who suddenly tries comedy for the first time has to stretch his or her idea of what it means to be an actor, when you start writing in English, you have to stretch your idea of what it means to do academic writing. You have to change it. You have to look through different eyes. And that's all. It's a lot, but it makes you more. It doesn't make you less, and it doesn't diminish the value of the way you write in Russian. Am I clear about this? Okay, so let's get to work. First of all, basically writing in English is almost 180 degrees different from writing in Russian. It's almost the entire opposite. Number one, we write in the active voice. We find that the passive voice is useless because it leaves out information. It takes longer to deliver the information. And the mark of the intellectual in English, unlike in French, Russian, or German, the mark of the intellectual in English is the person who can deliver the most information in the fewest possible words without leaving out any necessary information. We don't believe in wasting the reader's time. We think all of that nice, stylistic whatever that sounds so good, that's fine for literature. But we're busy. We want to get access to information. We don't want it to be interrupted by somebody's idea of good style. We want to get in there and find out what's the data. What's the research? What's the method? What's the theory? How did the person do it? Do we think this is good science? And so on and so forth. And what do we get that's new out of it? And we want to get it fast, and we want to get it clearly. The most important thing in English, bar none, is clarity. The writer must be 100% clear for every word. That means no assumptions about what the reader knows. My experience with Russian writing is that it's passive voice, it's great development of theory, and all of the details like who, what, where, context are left out because the reader is supposed to know it. In English, it's the opposite. An English paper is just if you remember nothing else I say today, remember this. An English paper is a self-contained universe. Everything that the reader needs to know for that paper is in that paper, in black and white, on the page, in the right order. And the right order has to do with Aristotle's empirical logic, but I'll get to that in a minute. The point is that the reader should never have to leave the page. The reader shouldn't have to hear a mention of a theory and go, I remember that theory, I read about it 2 years ago. Now, what did that theory say? Or when was that war? People sometimes, my European students will write about the financial crisis. And I laugh and I say, since 1929, there have been a lot of financial crises. Which one do you mean? They go, the last one. I say, you mean 2008? Yes. Well, you have to put that in. I do. Yes, you do. All the details have to be there. And I'll give you a very simple example out of the field of welfare state studies. Everybody knows that in welfare state studies that the classic typology of welfare states is by Gösta Esping Andersen, the liberal welfare state, the corporatist welfare state, and so on. But if your paper is going to say, actually, he was wrong and there are really only 2 types because 2 of his types are really kind of related, or maybe there's a 4th type, at some point in your argument, you're going to have to mention the typology. Now, everybody knows it. It doesn't matter. It's the right place in the argument to say the classic typology, of course, for welfare states is Gösta Esping Andersen's of type A, type B, and type C. Type A is this, type B is that, and type C is the other. That's the right place to put it. All the readers know it. But you have to make a mathematically precise argument with all the pieces in the right place, and the reader will skim it because the reader already knows it, but it has to be there. Otherwise, you look like you don't know what you're talking about. Okay? In English, we don't, even when we're writing a theoretical article, we don't theorize a paper. We don't narrate an idea. We don't discuss an idea. We create a mathematically precise argument according to Aristotle's empirical logic. Okay? And we have learned to write that way since we were 13 years old, except we weren't told it was Aristotle. Okay? And nobody else argues according to Aristotle except for the Greeks. They may have grammar problems, but they know how to argue because they grew up on Greek logic. It's Euclid and it's Aristotle. All right? And Russians, to my understanding and my experience, write primarily according to Aristotle's rationalism, which is that you don't have to prove things. Certain things can be understood and intuited as being true, so you don't have to prove them. So the writing is about theory, but not about proofs. And English writing is the opposite. It is only about proofs. You say, here is a topic, here is an issue in this field that nobody has looked at, and it's important because this paper will deal with it. We're going to use this method, not that method, because this method is better because, and here's why, and so on and so forth. And we're going to follow this theory, not that theory, because this theory is more applicable. And we explain, and we explain. And in English, the reader should be able to live in your mind, so that when the reader reads your paper, the reader is walking through your mind and your thinking, logical step by logical step, all the way down to the conclusions. Okay? So, am I right? This is different from Russian? Yeah. It's learnable. The Danes, the Norwegians, they don't learn any system of writing. The French argue according to Hegel, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The Germans learn that there is You have to have an introduction. You have to have a literature review. You have to have a theory. You have to have a method. And familiar? And I say to them, yes, but has anybody told you what goes in the introduction? And they, no. So English is extraordinarily structured. Once you learn the structure, and once you get the idea of the structure, you can then start analyzing papers in journals, but analyze the ones by native speakers. They will tend to be the best, not necessarily the best writing. Just like all Russians are not great writers, right? In Russian. Not all Americans or Brits or Canadians are great writers in English, but they argue very well. And you can start seeing the pattern of their argument and how they put an argument together. And little by studying these papers, because my experience with Russian scholars is you're all very bright, okay? You study them, you can learn how to imitate that style. Okay, the one thing you have to do, no matter what, and no matter how good you are, is when your paper is done, and that's after you've talked about it with your colleagues and rewritten it, that's after you've gone to an international conference and read it and had people comment on it, when you finally rewrite it, and you have to rewrite your paper at least 8 to 10 times to get it perfect, because in English every word has to be perfect. Native speakers write their papers 10, 12, 15 times. I teach writing skills, and when I wrote the first draft of this book 9 years ago, I sent it to 5 people to have a look at. And each of them had certain comments of things that I had missed because I was too close to the material. We always go to editors, and that's in our first language. And for you, it's a second language. Of course you would go to an editor. Okay? Never think that, because there are certain things a native speaker will see that you will miss. Okay? And that's just the way it is. So in English, there are 3 things that are extremely important. And I'm going to ask you if it's okay. I'll go for an hour and a half, and then I'll take questions. Is that all right? So I'll try to get the 4 hours into an hour and a half here. There are 3 major elements of the writing process in English. One is analysis. Okay, and I assume that you would be very good at analysis, depending what your field is, you know, what you do, and so on. The second is synthesis, and that's where writing as briefly as possible comes in. So, for example, for this book, I read all or parts of 15 to 20 books by or about Aristotle and synthesized what I needed for the book down to 2 pages. I couldn't put it all in, no matter how interesting. What mattered for the argument of my book? I wasn't writing about philosophy. I wasn't writing about logic. I wasn't writing about Greek logic. What was the most important thing that Aristotle had to say that had to do with, with writing? And that's what I put in. It's synthesis. When we do an introduction, we have only, and I'll get to this in a bit, 3 paragraphs to do a great deal of work. We have to synthesize only the most important elements in those 3 paragraphs, and then give it in detail later. Because an introduction is that. It's a short introduction. So synthesis is very important. And then something called framing. And framing is something that you pretty much don't do in Russian. Well, to explain framing, I think I'll go to the board and give you some diagrams. So hold on. Can you hear me if I talk like this? Okay. So, a linguist named Robert Kaplan, back in the early 1950s, came up with a number of symbolic diagrams for the rhetorical systems of various languages. And they were quite interesting, one of which was Russian, by the way, and I'll get to that. So, for example, if you're writing in the Semitic languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Amharic, you would start with your subject, then you would go to 0 degrees to 180, 0 to 180, 0 to 180, and you would conclude for one side or the other only with no gray in the middle. That's how they argue in the Middle East. I lived in the Middle East for a while, it's true. Now in Norway, which calls itself the peace country, everything is gray in the middle, and when you get to the extremes, they get very nervous. They don't like extremes. They like everything nice and gray in the middle, okay? If you are from Japan, China, or Korea, to go straight to the point is very uncultured and barbaric. So you use all kinds of stylistic tropes the way you might in Russian, and you kind of circle around like this until you get to the point. Oh, also, not in the sciences, but say in the social sciences or the humanities, you would never write a conclusion. You would say, this is what all the famous scholars in the field had to say about this subject. This is what I, humble little me, has to say, and you stop. Because to write a conclusion would be to insult your reader. Why? Because the Asian languages are 100% reader-responsible languages. The reader is supposed to figure everything out. The writer has no obligation, other than not to go straight to the point. Okay? So to put a conclusion would be to say to your reader, you're so stupid you can't figure this out by yourself. Okay? Now, if you're writing, is this interesting, isn't it? If you're writing in the Romance languages, Italian, Portuguese, French, Spanish, you start here. And then you take a digression. Could be a theory. You don't say why, you just kind of wander off. And the reader goes, okay. And comes down and then maybe takes another digression. You know? And like that. And ends. And in Russian, according to his symbology, the digressions are really huge. It's like way off the page, like this. And it reminds me of being, excuse me, reminds me of being 16 and reading the Brothers Karamazov in English, of course, sorry, and turning the page, and all of a sudden the brothers are gone, and there's this Grand Inquisitor, and who's the prisoner, and what's going on, and I'm looking back and saying, are some pages missing? Did the printer make a mistake? Did I miss something? I was totally confused, whereas a Russian will read it and just hang with it. It's just heading off somewhere, and then it'll come back, and everybody waits, right? Okay? So, given the things I've said about English, what do you think a diagram of English would look like? Anybody want to guess? Give it a shot. What would a diagram of English look like?
Just a guess, really structured one, mathematically structured.
Structured? And what would it look like, maybe?
Like a stairway.
Like a what?
Like a stairway.
Like a stairway? Oh, you're the first one who said that. I like that. Like a stairway, in a way.
Way up. Up.
Up? Well, okay. What most people say, I'll give you some help. It's late in the day. Is a straight line. Because English is that direct. But it's actually, I don't write very well, I don't draw very well. It's an arrow. Because everything in English, and you know, you don't have to know much about archery to know that if you're wobbling, you're not going to hit the target. So you've got to aim at something. What do you think that arrow in English is aiming at? What part of the paper is it aiming at? Conclusions. Absolutely. Everything is aiming at the conclusions. And it doesn't mean we can't have these digressions, but we have to frame them. Framing means you tell the reader what you're doing, why you're doing it, and where you're going next, so that the reader can follow everything in a logical, smooth way where each idea leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next, and the logic is made clear to the reader. So instead of zipping off like this, it has to be woven into the theory or the method or the extra discussion has to be woven into the direction of that arrow. Everything has to be aimed towards the conclusion. And there are some people, not everybody, certainly, but there are some people, because you don't start writing until your research is done. There are some people who will write their conclusions, put them up on the board in their office or on the wall in their office and say, okay, now, how am I going to organize my paper so I end up there? What do I need to start with? What needs to come next? What needs to come next? And we move pieces around. We move pieces around all the time. So, I'll give you a quick example. I finished a book-length manuscript in another field. I have another life. And gave it to an editor friend of mine who liked it a lot, but said she thought I should start it differently than the way I started it. And took my first 2 chapters and moved all the pieces around. And I didn't like the way she moved them around, but I understood her point that I should start with some other things. So I just came back from 3 weeks in Altai, where I went for holiday, and I took the beginning pages with me to the river, and I sat by the river, and for 4 days, all I did was move pieces around, find if I moved this here, then I had to add a piece here, but I had to take this piece here out, and if I moved this, I would have to do it a different way, and moved and moved and moved pieces around for 4 days until I got it to work in the way that I wanted. Do you see what I mean? We're constantly doing that. What do I need to do to organize my paper so I end up at the conclusions? Sorry. The conclusions should never be a mystery. It's not a detective story. It's not, Arist van Doren or, I love those books. And the last 3 aren't in English yet. It's driving me crazy. I want to read them. And they're not in English, and my Russian is lousy, so I can't do it. Anyway, it's not a mystery where you have to go first, second, third. Okay. When you get to the conclusions in English, the reader should say, when the reader gets there, the reader should say, of course. It's obvious. It's not a mystery. Because if the reader gets to your conclusions and says, how did they get to here from there? One of 2 things happened. One is the conclusions are wrong. And that's usually not the case. What happens is the writer didn't structure the paper well enough so that when they got to the conclusions, it was logical. It's all about empirical logic. And people say, but I'm writing a paper about theory. But you have to deliver your paper about theory in Aristotle's empirical logic. And someone said, but I'm writing about Hegel. Can't I write about Hegel and Hegelian logic? Not in English. You can write about Hegel, but you have to write about it according to Aristotle. It's the style of delivery. It's not the content. Are you with me? I'm not changing your content. Although sometimes I tell people to take content out. Because in English, the only thing that matters is the argument. Anything that distracts from your argument, even for 30 seconds, take it out, save it for another paper. The argument is the only thing that matters. It is the heart and soul of your paper. the argument. Okay? So that's, I think, the basic background on the biggest differences between Russian and English. Okay? So far, so clear? Yeah, I've worked with Russian students. And even though they took my course and spent 6 days with me, and some of them read the book, when I had to edit their papers, it wasn't just editing every sentence, it was editing every single line. And I'll give you a simple example. One was about Russian-Georgian relations way back with the Ossetia stuff. And it said shots were fired, something like that. And I'm writing to the guy and saying, Andre, did the Russians fire at the Georgians or did the Georgians fire at the Russians? You know, shots were fired by whom? The reader wants to know. The reader has to know. Well, each side said the other side started shooting first. I said, why didn't you say that? Each side accused the other side of starting the shooting. And he wrote back and said, I can say that. So that's also a political issue. But in research, yes. In research, yes, you have to tell the truth. So there are all these issues that are involved, okay? Also, in the field of international relations, how many of you are in international relations? Yeah, a number of you, okay. Papers take a long time to get written, rewritten. In IR, you can't wait that long. Because if you go with an idea to a conference, if you go here, if you go there, by the time you do it, the situation will have changed in that country and your paper will be dead. And that's what happened to a student of mine. He waited too long. And that's why in international relations, papers are not of the writing quality that you see in other fields, because people don't have time to polish them as well and make the writing perfect, because it's got to get it out now before there's a revolution and the whole subject is dead and your paper is dead. And a really good research paper about Turkey just went down the tubes because he waited too long. And if he'd sent it in a year earlier, it could have been published. So you have to think about those things as well. So let's get into, well, let me just ask, any questions so far? Anybody? Okay, let's get into argumentation itself. There was an American, there is, he's still alive I think, an American linguist named John Swales, who asked a really interesting question. The best research comes out of interesting questions. A good research question. And he said, okay, to get published, people have to find some way to create a space in the literature, in that field, for their research. And enough that their research is interesting enough that a journal wants to publish it. How do they go about doing that? And he read hundreds and thousands of papers in all kinds of fields. And he discovered that basically 99% of them all did the same thing. And he calls this method, and it's not a method he developed, it's a method he observed, okay? And he calls it CARS, because that's easy to remember, all in caps, C-A-R-S. And let me explain to you how it works, because this is how you have to start your research paper and start your argument. I want you to think of research, of the literature. It's not literature. It's always called the literature in any field, as a solid block of concrete. And your job is to find a little hole or a little chip or a little scratch in it where your paper can go so it can become part of the literature. Okay? So he said there was a 3-step process. I think he left out a step, and I'm going to add it. The first one is to establish the territory. You begin your paper. Sorry, my handwriting stank when I was a child, and it hasn't gotten better. Establish the territory. What does that mean? Okay, watch me for a second. This is international relations. It's huge. Nobody can write a paper about international relations, right? Or political science, right? It's too huge. What is the territory within that field in which your research takes place? So if it were about labor, is it labor of, or economics, economics of the family? Is it labor economics? Is it econometrics? Is it economics of single parent households? Do you see what I mean? What is the territory? Are you looking at these particular countries? Are you looking at these particular types of economies? Are you looking at a political struggle between two countries? What is the territory? Are you all with me? So I'll give you a sample generic sentence. Most studies in the field of X focus on the relationship between A and B. Okay? That sets up your territory, and you get a paragraph or two or something about that, explaining the territory. So that's the first thing you have to do. The second thing you do is to establish your niche. Your niche is what is missing. What's missing in the literature? However, very few studies look at this, or almost no studies examine that. What's missing in the literature? That's the niche. And unless you can have access to all the literature, how are you going to know what a niche is? My heart goes out to all of you who don't have access to the journals. I don't know how you can do it. Try to find a friend at one of those other universities who will let you use their email. I'm serious. I don't know what else you can do, because if you can't read all the papers in your field, how will you know what's missing in the literature so that you can deliver something new? And your literature review part in most papers shows that you are familiar with all the literature. So-and-so says this and so-and-so says that. And the purpose of a literature review, which usually comes after the introduction, but not necessarily, it depends on the journal. The purpose of a literature review is to show, A, that you actually know all the literature, but that you can prove that you can prove that these papers did this, and these studies did that, and this study looked at the same thing your study is looking at, but from a different angle and for a different purpose, and yours is the first to do something new and important. Okay? So, what's Wales left out? And so let me give you a niche sentence. However, almost no studies look at the relationship of B to B plus 1. The problem is the reader says, never heard of it. Who cares? So what Swales left out is, it's not enough to establish the niche. You have to sell the reader on the importance of your niche. Never, ever assume anything in English. Never assume the reader sees it's important because you see it's important. We say in American English about the word assume, A-S-S-U-M-E, that when you assume something, you make an ass out of you and me. Okay? A-S-S-U-M-E. Okay? I mean, no assumptions in English. Everything is explicit. Nothing in English is implicit. Not one thing in English is ever implicit. In writing, in speech, yes. In academic writing, no. That's why I said a paper is a self-contained universe. The reader should never have to leave it to think about a theory, to remember when a war was, to remember when so-and-so was assassinated, or whatever. Okay? This is really critical. So you have to tell the reader it's important. So I'll show you an idea of how you would do that. You could say, okay, the territory is most studies in the field of whatever focus on the relationship between A and B. Almost no studies, however, examine the relationship of B to B plus 1, comma, a relationship critical for our understanding of the important processes or the important dynamics of XYZ. Do you see what I'm saying? Now the reader says, oh, I never thought of that. That's interesting. I want to read this paper. You have to sell it. That's a whole different way of thinking, isn't it? You have to sell the reader on the importance of your niche. You can't assume the reader will see it just because you do, or just because you're interested in it. Never use the word interesting. It is a student word. It is the kiss of death. You think I'm kidding. I'm not. The reader is a very selfish creature who doesn't care at all about you or what's interesting to you. The reader says, I'm really busy. I've only got time this week to read 2 papers, which are the most important for me, that are going to give me data and information and theory and method that will be valuable for me in my career. Me. So the reader wants something that isn't interesting. The reader wants something valuable, important, critical, essential, necessary, crucial, useful, helpful. You got it? Yeah. So there are all these words you need. That's why everybody needs a good native speaker editor to get rid of all those words and make them stronger and so on. I can make anybody sound like a native speaker and a really good writer as long as you've done your work right and you've got everything in the right order and argued well. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's how I get people published all the time in some really top journals. And it makes me really happy because I feel I'm the midwife. I didn't make the baby, I didn't carry the baby, I didn't birth the baby, but I helped bring the baby out healthy. So that's my part. And it's a nice part. So now let's get on to step number 3. So 2 has 2A, establish your niche. This is what I'm adding that Swales didn't say. And its importance. And then step 3 is to occupy the niche. And you occupy the niche with a purpose statement. Now, a purpose statement is a misnomer. Misnomer means it's the wrong word, but it's the term everyone uses. The purpose of writing a paper is to get it published so you can have a career. That's the only reason anybody writes a paper. Nobody would write a paper otherwise. And we're all very clear on this concept. It is the framing sentence for the entire paper. It tells the reader, not in tiny little details, but in a real broad brush stroke, what the paper is going to be about. It is active voice, and it uses the strongest verbs possible. And let me see if I can quickly pull some out of here, some examples. What goes where in the paper? I thought I had some here, but maybe not. Anyway, an example might be this paper analyzes the relationship of A to B and shows its economic impact on the lives of these people in this country. Okay? That's what the paper is going to do. And then your paper has to do exactly that. And you have to, often people use a using phrase at the beginning. Using famous scholars' theory of this and applying other famous scholars' method of that, this paper analyzes the relationship of B to B plus 1. Okay? Then you can say more specifically, it uses data from Russia to blah, 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 blah. But it's one sentence, and you have to write it very well because it is the only sentence that will appear twice in your paper, and maybe even 3 times. It will appear in your abstract, and it will appear exactly the same words. It will appear in your abstract, and it will appear in your introduction. And it may even reappear at the end of the paper in the conclusion. It depends. Okay? Depends on how they write conclusions in that journal. So this is how you start a paper. But here is where synthesis comes in. You have to do all 3 steps in the first 3 paragraphs of your paper. The latest that your purpose statement can come is the first sentence of paragraph 4. And your paragraphs cannot be long. Okay, just like we like short sentences in English, we like short paragraphs. Short being relative. So let me explain what a short English sentence is. I can't give you numbers of words because it depends if they're big, if they're small. So there are 2 ways to tell when a sentence in English is too long, because a sentence in English does one thing, or possibly 2, well, but no more than 2 ever. It can't just keep going on and on and on like a German sentence. So, if you have paper with, let's say, 2.5 centimeter margins all the way around, and you use a Times New Roman or Times 12-point font, no sentence in English should ever be longer than 3.5 or 4 lines. And 4 lines is pushing it. 3 lines is better than 3.5 or 4. You can have the occasional really long sentence. But if the sentence is over 4 lines, find a way to break it up and make it 2. People hate reading long sentences. And they feel the same way about paragraphs. So let me ask you, in Russia, when you're a student in high school or whatever, do you study paragraphing?
Yeah.
You do?
You mean English classes?
No, Russian.
No.
No, I mean in Russian. So in English classes you study paragraphing? Can you give me an example of like what?
So, thesis statement, evidence, arguments, conclusion.
No, a paragraph, not a paper, just a paragraph.
Yeah, the same structure paragraph.
Okay, types of paragraphs. Yeah, because we study types of paragraphs. We start when we're 12 or 13. We study descriptive paragraphs, or instructive paragraphs, or narrative, storytelling paragraphs. Comparative, looking for things that are the same. Contrastive, looking for things that are different, and so on and so forth. And we study them, and we are taught that the paragraph is the essential unit of meaning, so that therefore the reader should be able to read it in one sitting without having to stop in the middle to understand it and keep going. So basically that means for academic writing, where paragraphs can be a little longer than out in the regular, let's say, public, and the regular public, no paragraph should ever be over 14 lines. And you're better off keeping your length at 12 rather than 14, with only the occasional 14-line paragraph. The other thing, very quickly, is that in English, as in Russian, we believe that you shouldn't repeat certain things, right? Shouldn't repeat words, but we understand it differently. We don't repeat adjectives, adverbs, and verbs. We don't say quickly, quickly, quickly. We say quickly, speedily, fast. We don't say examine, examine, examine. In one sentence it's examine, in another it's analyze, in another it's investigate. But we never change the noun. Never. We never change the main noun of our paper. Ever. That's not done. So for example, let me think. I see papers written by Europeans. It's very funny. They will write teenager in one line, then adolescent in the next one, then young people in the next one, then youth in the next one, and then they're desperate. And they write youngster, which is wrong because that's preteen, and that's incorrect. You analyze the journal. What word shows up most in that journal? If adolescent is the word that shows up most, you use adolescent as your noun, and that's the only word you use for your entire paper. That's it. Memorize that. For us, it's like changing the name of the character in a novel every other line. It's crazy. Like, who is this character? What's the character's name? The character has a name. Don't change it. It's the same principle. It's so strict that if we write committee with a capital C in one line, and 5 lines later write committee with a small c, the reader thinks we mean a different committee. So don't mess with the nouns. I think that giving the reader a long paragraph is like giving the reader a half a kilo of steak at the end of a fork and saying, it's all yours if you can eat it in one bite. And the reader goes, the person goes, I can't do that. I can't even get it in my mouth, let alone digest it. The reader in English sees a very long paragraph and says, I can't digest that in one reading. And the reader goes into what Americans call mego reading, all in caps, M-E-G-O. And it stands for my eyes glazed over. Have you ever been reading a paper or a book that you had to read for a course at your university or something, and all of a sudden your eyes glazed over and you said, I don't really want to read this anymore, and you just put it down? And if you didn't have to come back to it, did you ever go back to it? No. Do you want an editor to do that with your paper? Do you want a reviewer to do that with your paper? No. The whole purpose of everything I'm teaching you is to help you get your paper sent out for review. But it can't be sent out for review if the editor thinks it's not well organized, it's not well written, it is illogical, it doesn't make sense, the grammar is bad. Okay? It will be, it's called a desk reject. In 24 to 48 hours, your paper comes back saying, sorry, we can't use it. You want to avoid that. You can't, you have no guarantee about the reviewers you get. 90+ % of the time they're great. Every so often there's the reviewer from hell. Maybe that person, let's see, maybe that person wants to publish on the same subject and wants to publish first. Doesn't want you to publish. Maybe you said method A is better than method B, and that reviewer championed method B and is angry at you. You never know. So sometimes you get a crappy reviewer. Most of the time they're good. And most of my students tell me that 90% of the time they learn more from the reviewers. They're really, really happy with what they get for the reviewers, and it makes it a different paper. If your paper is published, it will never be the paper you first submitted. It will always be a different paper because the reviewers will want something different. And you better be good at cutting out all the words you don't need. Because if, let's say, 6,000 words is the limit, and you're at 6,000 words, and they want another analysis and another discussion, and you're going to have to add 1,000 words. You're going to have to take out 1,000 words from your original paper. You better be good at this. And that's why I teach my students all the time as part of argumentation to use only content words, only the words that count, and any word that isn't content to keep as short as possible. For example, due to the fact that it's cold outside, I wore a jacket. So due to the fact that 5 words means what? What does it mean? Because. Why waste, why do 5 words when you can do one that gives you 4 more words in your sentence for content? The reader should focus on content, not on all these fancy words. Don't say in the month of August. What else is August? A kapusta? I mean, come on. It's a month. Or some people say the year of 2018. So what else is 2018? Or in a professional manner. No, professionally. Or to a large extent. No, largely. To a great extent. Greatly. Keep these short so that you have room in your sentence for what? For content. Learn to cut those words out. I can go through almost any 20, 30 page paper and cut out 300 to 500 words with no trouble. Because there's ways to cut them out and tighten the sentence. Every word should count in English. There should be no wasted words. And your style comes out of being clear in the fewest possible words. That's what makes good style in English. Not all the nice things that you would do in Russian. They don't work. They don't work in English. It really, am I right? It's almost opposite? In some ways?
Depends.
Depends. For example?
For example, there are many authors in Russian who some minimalistic style.
Okay.
So, but there are another.
Yeah. Minimalistic works as long as you don't sacrifice meaning. You have to have all the details. The reader wants context. Who, what, where, why, when. The reader always wants context. The reader needs the necessary details, not unnecessary details. And it takes practice figuring out what those are. But also, it's something like, instead of saying the financial crisis of 2008, you write the 2008 financial crisis, and one word is gone. And if you need to cut down words to get under the limit, that's one way to do it. There are all kinds of tricks. And the thing about writing in English, as writing in any language, is the more you do it, the first paper is the worst, because that is your learning curve, your very high learning curve. After that, you get an idea. Okay, now I know what to do. Now I know how to start. Now I know where to go. Now, an introduction, depending on the journal, journals are all very different, may end with an organization paragraph that says, this paper is organized as follows, or the rest of this paper proceeds as follows. It's just the same words over and over like that. Section 1 does, Section 2, because the introduction was Section 1. Section 2 does this, Section 3 does this, Section 4 does this. It's nice if they have numbered sections. If not, it's a lot harder to say, the next section will present the method, followed by a section on the theory of blah, blah, blah. Then comes whatever. It's a little harder to write, but it works. And what you have to do, I have an entire, not chapter, but section in the book on journal analysis. And that's part of your argument. You never start thinking about your argument until you've eliminated all journals that will not fit this paper, and then analyzed the most recent year's worth of papers in that journal for organization, for language, for content. Do they use we and I, but not we and I in the abstract? Do they use past tense for the conclusion, or do they use present tense? If they have a discussion and a conclusion, is the discussion short and the conclusion long, or vice versa? And what order are they in? Do they give method first or theory first? And I remember one paper when I first hadn't developed journal analysis, where the young woman was writing for a journal that had a contest for young researchers. And if you won the contest, you could have your paper published, even though you didn't have a PhD or whatever. And she wrote a really good paper, and you could follow from the theory how the theory led into the method. It was wonderful. But I was looking through the journals, and I said, Miriam, all of these papers have the method before the theory. And she started talking. That doesn't make sense because blah, blah, blah. I said, shh, do you want to be right or do you want to get published? She said, give me 20 minutes. She was fast. She's always fast. And she came back. She'd rewritten it. She tied for first place. Okay? You do it the way they do it in that journal because the editor likes it. And you make the editor happy. In English, the only person who counts is the reader. You don't count. It's very hard, after our whole education where, we're supposed to learn things and maybe people want to know what we think and our teachers want to know and so on, to all of a sudden discover that you are not important. Only your data, only your research, only your argument. Okay? So our job is to make the reader happy. Not because the English reader is stupid. The English reader is not stupid, any more than a Russian reader is stupid. The point is that from the time we learn to write, we are taught that total clarity and framing and explaining and blah, 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 and everything else I've said so far is the writer's responsibility. Because the opposite of Chinese and Japanese, English is, and academic English in particular, is the world's only 100% writer-responsible language. The reader has no obligation to understand something that isn't there, to fill in missing information, to know what the writer means when the writer mentions something but doesn't explain it. You have to, the minute you mention a new term, you have to define it instantly. My European writers are always saying, but I'm going to define it in the next section. Too late, you've already confused the reader. The reader doesn't want to be confused. You give a very brief definition and then in parentheses say, the methods section will describe this, whatever it is, in greater detail. Close parentheses. That's it. And the reader knows, okay, I got the idea of what it is, now I know, and I know more is coming later, and I'm happy. Okay? We want happy readers. We want readers who think we're brilliant because our writing was so easy to read. Not dumb writing, not writing for 10-year-olds. So you might be asking, how do we show our sophistication in English if we don't repeat nouns and if we keep our sentences short? How we do it in English is to almost never have two sentences in a row in the same grammatical form. We're constantly changing our grammar. We're beginning with a subject and a verb and an independent clause. Maybe the next sentence starts with a dependent clause and then the independent clause. Maybe it starts with an ing phrase or a to plus a verb phrase. Maybe it starts with a prepositional phrase. We do this and use the language to build our argument. So our use of every word and every phrase is to build our argument and to strengthen it. And we also never have paragraphs of the same length in a row. If you have three, psychological research shows, if you have 3 or 4 8-line paragraphs or 10-line paragraphs in a row, the reader starts getting uncomfortable. We vary our sentence length, we vary our sentence structure, we vary our paragraph structure. Okay, that's how we show our sophistication. It's in the writing and in the way in which we create and strengthen and deliver our argument. Okay, now how the first part of journal analysis, very quickly, is to eliminate, as I said, anything that doesn't fit the paper. If your paper is heavily theoretical, then you can eliminate all the primarily empirical journals. If your paper is maybe half theoretical, half empirical, you need to find a journal that is comfortable with that kind of paper. If not, and you need to be doing this while you're doing your research, because if not, you maybe want to structure your research and write your paper differently so that you have more choices of journals. You see my point? There are some journals that have the entire theory plus the literature review, both, in a very, very long introduction. And some introductions are only 4 paragraphs. They're all different. So you need to find one that's a match. One of my Russian students in IR had a problem, had to do with Russia's relationship with the Far East. She had to find an English language journal that considered Russia part of Asia. Now think about this. If we look at the whole Federation, right? We look at everything including Sibir, what do we get? 1/9 of the entire land of the entire planet, right? And yet, the Europeans don't consider Russia European. The Asians don't consider Russia Asian. Russia, and I studied Russian history, so I know some things, has never decided if it's European, if it's Asian, if it's going to go both ways, or if it's going to forget everybody. It keeps changing its mind, as I recall. Okay? So she had to find a journal that would about Asian studies that would publish an article on Russia. And she looked at all the journals and it narrowed down to 2. There were only 2. And in the last 4 years, one of them had published an article on Russia and the other one hadn't. So she was really limited to 1, more or less. Fortunately, that one took her paper. And it's a very good journal. But you see what I mean? You have to really think, what are the questions you need to ask in choosing the right journal? Often rejections come not because it's not a good paper, but because the person chose the wrong journal. They didn't do a proper journal analysis. And what I found is that people that I was teaching many years ago and worked with, who were getting published a lot, in a particular research institute, 3 of them in 6 months got a rejection. And that was really unusual. They were getting published. Their publication, percentages went up. They were happy. They hired me all the time. So what went wrong? And I went to all 3 people, and they all said the same thing: I picked the wrong journal. They had gotten a little bit lazy. They got in the habit of analyzing the journal they chose rather than being careful first about choosing the right journal. So if you want to get, say, into a top journal, a really, really good journal at the top of the field, they want something huge. They want an entirely new method, an entirely new theory. They want something that will change the field, and often the subject you're writing about is an illustration of a larger problem or a larger method, but the subject you're writing about isn't the main thing. When you get into the little bit lesser journals, it's different. And when somebody sends back a paper saying it's a really nice paper, but it just isn't a big enough issue for our hugely varied international readership, that screams bad journal analysis. Okay? So these are things you have to keep in mind, that when you create your argument, you create it in terms of the journal. Does method come before theory or vice versa? Do they not have a theory section and they go straight to method? Do they write more in some journals in IR are more like essays. They're more like essays. They're not really research. And that's a different breed. But then how do they set up their essays? You have to analyze. How do they start? Where do they head? How do they end? What are the patterns? So that you can mimic that pattern. You have to make your abstract look like the abstracts in the journal. What does the first sentence tend to do? Is it territory? Is it niche? Or do they start with this paper, and do they use paper, article, or study? What word do they use? You want to use the word they use the most. You want to make your abstracts look like theirs, because that's what the editor likes. Find the patterns. They don't have to be 50% or 80% patterns. If 80% of the papers are all different, but 20% of them do something the same way, the editor likes that. Do it for your paper. This is to maximize your chance of getting your paper sent out for review. Okay? Yes, question?
Yeah, can I ask a direct question?
Of course.
Should we or does the journal analysis precedes the writing of the paper?
Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you should do it while you are planning your research. While you are planning your research, you should be looking at the journals. You should be looking at possible journals saying this kind of research, this kind of paper, not that one, One of the things that's a bit of a surprise to me as a native speaker of English is that the Brits, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, by the time they're in a PhD program, usually by their senior year of the bachelor's degree, when they know they're going to go on, they're becoming journal literate. They're knowing all the journals. They're planning what journal they could send their senior thesis if it's turned into a paper to be, and so on. And in Europe, people become, it seems to me in Europe and in Russia, familiar with the journals only much later. And that puts you at a disadvantage because we've been studying them from the beginning, reading journal articles in our undergraduate work and being familiar with what these journals tend to publish, whether it's history or sociology or political science or whatever else. So you have to really work at this. I mean, I'm recommending my book to everybody, not because I make money on it. I just did the revision, and I tried for over a year to get European publishers so that it could be distributed in Europe cheaper for everybody. And one publisher wanted to change it, another one didn't want to give royalties, and it was back and forth and back and forth. And finally I said, forget it. So I created a publisher and I did it myself. And I'll never make the money back on it, but it's my gift to Europe and to Russia. They're both gone now, but I had a European parent and an American parent. One was an artist, one was an engineer, and they constantly talked past each other. And I was the oldest child, and it was my job to mediate their language and their marriage. And of course, being a child, I failed. But I grew up trying to understand and being interested in how different cultures made people think differently. They were using different language, but they meant the same thing, and they ended up arguing because they used different words and they thought they meant something different. So I want to level the playing field so that all of you have a chance to compete with native speakers of English. That's the whole point, and that's why I wrote the book. I know it's expensive for Russians because it's a $60 textbook, but it just came out, and Amazon doesn't have them yet, and I'm having someone do research into what Amazon would charge for shipping. Okay? I can get 3 books into one envelope, and that's $11 shipping per book because I can keep it down. I want it to get to you the least expensive way. I don't care if it's my website or Amazon, but I wrote the book for you to study, for you to work with, because if you do everything in there, you will be able to succeed. And I want you to succeed. So, as I said, I'll never make the money back on it. It's my investment in what I believe in, which is your chance to succeed. I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing if we want to have time for questions, we should probably get into it now. I can talk a little more about argumentation, but I think you've got the idea. A lot of it's like a big river with hundreds of tributaries along the way. And your trick as a writer to figure out, okay, your main river is your argument. But where do you bring in this method? And where do you bring in the alternative method? And where do you bring in this idea? And where do you bring in that analysis? So the trick for every writer is to figure out where those tributaries should go. And it isn't easy, but the more you practice and the more you do it and the more you study the way native speakers of English do it, the better you're going to get at it. Argumentation is the hardest thing I teach because it isn't just a technical skill where you can memorize the pieces and parts. It involves a huge amount of thinking, and especially in political science and IR, you're creating a structure, you're creating an argument on your own. You don't have a form. Economists have a form. They say, here's a problem, here's a model, there's a problem, we have an answer. We use so-and-so's method. We do this analysis, we do that analysis, we do the other. Now we do these 5 analyses to check whether we did it right or not, and now we conclude. So they have the same model they follow all the time for all their papers. It's easy. It's not easy in your fields. And so you have to really practice thinking in a new way. But the more you can get your hands on English language articles, then the better off you're going to be for figuring out how to do this. So I think it's a good point to stop and ask if anybody's got questions. I'm sure you have a few. Yes?
Like probably I should start again. Like it is again to this like journalist analysis that you talked about. How important is the status of the writer? Like I mean, because like nowadays as a master's student, like how many opportunities do I have to publish a paper?
It doesn't matter what your status is. It matters what your argument and how good your paper is. Okay, but one of the things you would do in a journal analysis is look at where it's a very good question, where the authors come from. If the authors are all from Oxford and Harvard and Berkeley and this, whatever, and they're all professors, then maybe not. But otherwise, why not? Why not? Nobody cares who you are. Status isn't that important. It's what you have to say. Is it important enough? For example, yesterday in the 4-hour lecture, I had time to give people a 6-paragraph introduction that I use in the book and analyze how the writer created her argument, word by word, sentence by sentence, line by line, how she followed Aristotelian argumentation. I do want to say a few things about that. And the thing is, this was her first paper. It was an incredible paper. It was quantitative and qualitative. It was 46 pages before the bibliography. And I thought it was one of the most brilliant pieces of argumentation I had seen. And when I went, after I got permission from the publisher to use it, you get the permission for books. You don't need permission for papers, but you need permission if you're doing a book. I Googled her because I knew she was at Tulane in New Orleans because I wanted to send her a copy of the book and let her know that I was using this. I thought she'd like it. Somebody else thought she was good too because she was now teaching at Harvard. And that was her first paper. But it was that good. And it changed the field. She showed that everybody else in the field had made incorrect assumptions and that she had a better method and it worked better. But also, 2 other things. One is to create a research space, you have to find fault with the literature. Somebody's method doesn't work as well, research is lacking, nobody's looked at something. Be very careful to use nice language, not insulting language, about the people whose writing or conclusions you're criticizing to create your argument, because one of them will be one of your reviewers. Okay? And this woman basically wiped the floor with all of her colleagues. I mean, she showed they were all wrong by her second paragraph. But she did it so nicely that she made friends out of everybody. It's brilliant. It's in the book. I mean, it's totally brilliant. Instead of saying you're a bunch of idiots, she says, well, here's a dilemma. What alternative or additional material do we need? You know, and she's bringing everybody. Oh, it was brilliant. Okay. Now, Aristotle. Let me talk a little bit because English argumentation is based on Aristotle. Aristotle systematized the study of rhetoric. And he defined it, let me quote. He defined it as follows. He defined, and of course translated by somebody from the Greek, he defined rhetoric as the art of finding the best available means of persuasion in any situation. So the purpose of rhetoric, the purpose of writing is to persuade. You want to persuade the editor that your paper is good enough to send out for review. You want to persuade the reviewers that it's so good that they should recommend publication, right? You want to persuade readers to cite it because it's so exciting, okay? Now, Aristotle conceived of persuasion as a strategy, and he came up with 3 tactics for that persuasion, for that strategy. And you have to have all 3 in your paper. The first one, obviously, is logos, good logical reasoning. Okay? That is good analytical reasoning. A second one, they're not in any particular order. Excuse me, I just need a little water. The second one is ethos. And this gets back to your question. Nobody's heard of you. Nobody knows who you are. You send in a paper. I'm the editor. How do I know that you have the right to stand in the community of scholars as an equal? How do I know that you know anything about the field? How do you show me that you know something about the field? Right from the start of your paper. Anybody? What do writers do over and over in English papers to show that they are knowledgeable in the field?
Cite other authors?
Citations. So for example, in this introduction I was talking about from yesterday, every single sentence in her first paragraph had a citation, or 2, or 3, or 4. Why? Because in an introduction, almost every sentence at the beginning of the introduction is going to be a conclusion that you haven't proved. For example, most papers in the field of X focus on the relationship between A and B. That's a conclusion. But if I follow it with famous scholar 1999, famous scholar 2001, famous scholar 2003, famous scholar, and you put the most important ones, showing that you've read them and you know them, that means that these papers have all passed the double-blind anonymous review process and been recognized as legitimate good research. Now, because these people have found this conclusion, these are now facts in the field. And you are not making a conclusion, you are citing a well-known fact in the field. Do you see what I mean? And your introductions will be top-heavy with lots and lots of citations. Literature review citations, theory section citations, methods citations. When you get to your research and your work and your conclusions and your findings, that's when the citations kind of disappear, because that's your work. Okay? So that's how you show your ethos. You show that you know. And I read a paper recently that I had to consult on, and I was pretty shocked, because what the person did was, every time he or she would say, so-and-so, 2010, wrote, quote, and it was all quotations of what these people said. And I said, you can't do that, because then you're not writing a paper. All you're doing is quoting what they say. You have to paraphrase what they say. You can quote the most important words, but you have to paraphrase it to show that you understand the main point of what they're saying. You can't just quote everybody. Okay? So did that answer your question? Plus?
Yes.
Plus?
Yes,
Good.
thank you very much.
Somebody else?
what is like when the third?
Oh, the third. I'm sorry. You're right. This is what happens when I have a cold. My brain decides it wants to get tired. The third is pathos. Pathos is pretty much in your fields. It would be appealing to the values most deeply held by the reader. And the values almost always are, we want the best. We want the best possible data set for working with this issue. We want the best possible theory for understanding how this works. We want the best possible method. We want, do you see what I'm saying? And you have to show that this method is the best for doing such and such because the other methods do this and that, but they don't cover this area. And my new method covers what they cover, plus it covers this new area, so it is a better method. People always want that. They always want the best. And you have to say that. And I showed in the analysis yesterday of that introduction how she used ethos, how she used logos, how she used pathos. All three elements have to be in your paper and, of course, in your introduction. Okay, this is very, very important. You have to sell the importance of what you're doing. It's, it's not quite like, you know, haggling with a babushka in the corner about how much to pay for the yabliki or, you know, whatever. But it's still a form of selling. It's a form of advertising. And someone yesterday said about this particular introduction, she's claiming a whole lot that she's doing. She's saying she's doing this and she's doing that. I said, yes, but it was a 46-page paper, and everything she said she did, she did. That was the point. You don't claim, you know, that you're saving the world or that your paper is the only paper anybody should read about, but you have to tell the reader why what you've done is important, because otherwise they're not going to know. So you don't want to be arrogant, but you want to sound confident. It's very important in English to sound confident. And the big secret is that if you organize your writing well and you use the fewest words possible, you look really competent and confident. When your sentences get very, very long, you look like you're not in control. You look like you're trying to hide things. And don't use hedge words. Hedge words are what, Scandinavians use them all the time because I think of it as Scandinavian purism. Who am I to think that I'm the only one who, maybe I didn't read a paper about, maybe I missed one, so they say, this seems to suggest that under certain circumstances, one could possibly understand this whatever is maybe meaning, and they go on and on like that. It will kill you in English because you sound like you are not confident about your own research. You're in control of your research. You believe in it. You believe that your research is good, your conclusions are good, your methods are good. You have to sound confident, not arrogant. A friend told me recently about a colleague who never gets published because he always writes, everybody else in the field is an idiot and I'm the only one who knows, blah, blah, blah. And he's so puzzled that he doesn't get published. He thinks all the reviewers are stupid because he's so arrogant. So, other questions? Anything, no matter how wild. Off the topic.
May I ask you?
Yes.
I would like to ask you about methodology. You mentioned that the researcher should use the method which is better suited for this topic, for this research. But as we got to know in Russia in international relations, in Europe, researchers most often use mathematical methods, and in Russia we don't use mathematical methodology a lot. We use historical methods, different others. And what about common practice in foreign journals? I mean, does specific journal prefers specific method or a combination of methods, or you can really be free to decide?
No, you have to analyze the journal. That's a really good question. I wasn't aware of mathematical problems in international relations.
Yes.
What, mathematical models? Statistical models?
Statistical models.
Statistical models,
Right.
okay. Depends on the journal. You have to look at them. If people do historical methodology, this is a guess, okay? I'm just guessing off the top. People could look at it as more of an essay and less research. You know, anybody can read the history. Where's your research? So you would want, for more historical perspectives, to find a journal that does more essay type writing, rather like the Journal of, what is it? Foreign Affairs Journal? Something like that.
Yes.
That does that kind of writing rather than the research, or learn the statistical methods and apply them. So you would have to see what the journals do. Okay? And that's part of the journal analysis. You could do whatever you want, but if you send it to the wrong journal, it's almost guaranteed to be rejected. Oh, please, yes. No. I was just going to say, for example, in sociology and ethnography, there are quantitative and qualitative papers. And one woman said, well, I want to send in this paper to blah, blah, blah journal. And I happen to help a lot of people get published in that journal. And I said to her, your work is totally quantitative. And that's a qualitative journal. And she said, no, 1 out of every 7 papers is quantitative. I said, yes, maybe, but first of all, those are lousy odds. And second, those people are used to reading qualitative papers. So you would have to change a lot of your language to being qualitative, because if you did all your usual quantitative stuff, it's not going to fit that journal. She said, well, they should have studied quantitative methods when they were in school. Hey, it's not my problem. So, of course, it came back immediately rejected. Very interesting paper, but too quantitative for our journal. Duh. It was obvious. I don't know about a lot of the journals, but it's obvious to me that it's the wrong journal. It's the wrong journal. So that's an issue that will come up. So don't ever get your heart set on, oh, I want to be published in blah, blah, blah journal. That's a big mistake. Be very honest about what your chances are for a certain paper. Yes?
In this relation, like, what about self-publishing and what about self-promotion? How legitimate is that?
Self-publishing how? Like, how would you go about?
For example, I've seen a lot of scholars, for example, I don't know, they were not published in like really famous journals, but they were publishing their papers just like so online, they put it online. And actually, like most of those papers, I should admit, they weren't like really helpful, or I couldn't like use it for my paper.
Right.
But still, some of them like were giving hints, and in some ways, like really small percentage of them, but they were like, they could have been used for my paper as well.
Except you couldn't cite them because they weren't published in journals.
Yes.
Right. There's a big discussion. I'm on researchgate.com, And there's a big discussion about that, about self-publishing. Or somebody asked the question, what about people who just want to get papers out there that journals don't want? And basically, if the journals don't want the paper, 9 times out of 10, there's something wrong with the paper. Okay? So I wouldn't do it unless you got so many rejections. You just said, the hell with it. But you're also opening yourself up to the possibility that people will look at this and say it's not a very good paper. Okay? If you follow all the steps and you argue well and you figure out that they have a new section every so many pages and you have a new section so many pages, and you keep everything kind of like the journal. If you chose the right journal, you should have a good shot. Now, there are professors, mostly the older professors in Europe, who would tell their students, no, don't write for the journal, write a generic paper, because if it gets rejected by journal A, you can immediately send it to journal B. And my answer in my usual tactful way is that that's very stupid advice, because there's no such thing as a generic journal. So it won't fit any of the journals. So if you write a research paper, not an essay paper, but a research paper, and you send it to journal A, and alas, poor paper, it gets rejected. Well, your method is still the same. Your theory is still the same. Your data is the same, right? Your findings are the same. Your conclusions are the same. You have to rewrite the abstract, the introduction, the conclusion. But you don't have to rewrite everything to send it to a new journal. And that's what happens. People turn it around, fix the beginning, fix the end, and it gets accepted by the second journal. Okay? But all of these are great questions. Nobody else? Are you being shy, or have I bored you? So, it's up to you. I can keep talking about something, or we can go home. It's your seminar. What do you want?
Probably one question from me, if possible.
Okay. Okay.
I would like to ask you about research task and how to specify it. I mean, should it be quite narrow or not, and at what extent?
It all depends on what you want to do. There is research that is very long term. You look at 30 years worth of patterns. And there is research that looks at a 6-month period and digs very, very deeply and narrowly into economic, political, social, and other factors in that period that cause a change. So there are the longitudinal studies, which are broader and wider, and then there are the deeper, narrower ones. You want to look as part of your journal analysis, what do they do most in that journal? More longitudinal, more narrow and deep, or a mix of the two? But I think you have to decide what is it you want to research. But you can't really know what you want to research until you've read what other researchers have done on that topic. The one thing that all of you probably will miss that I enjoyed when I was younger, because it was before the internet. When I studied history at Berkeley, if we were in the honors program, in the second half of our bachelor's studies, we got what were called stack privileges. That meant instead of ordering a book out of the book catalog in the library and waiting for it to come, we could go back into the stacks of books and we could go to look for the book we wanted, that we knew about, But then we could look at the book next to it, and the book next to it, and the book above it, and the book below it, and the book near it. And often those other books had the really good stuff that we wanted, but we hadn't heard of those books. And the problem with a Google search or any searches like that is it narrows you down by the words you give it, and you don't get a chance to go a little bit outside the box and get new ideas. And that I remember as a wonderful, wonderful thing. You don't have that anymore because books aren't kept like that. But that was something special. And I would suggest for everybody it may not be appropriate in your field, but sometimes people like theories that come from another field, kind of like cross-pollination. For example, you might take a theory from geography and apply that to something in international relations or political science and get something really neat out of that. So I would say pick a related field, not something totally different like ice hockey, okay? But I mean something related that interests you, and do a little reading in that field as well, because it might give you ideas for bringing in something new. I've seen it where people bring in something from psychology into anthropology, and the psychologists all know it, but the anthropologists are all excited because it's something new. And bringing in a theory from somewhere else. So don't be so narrow that you only have one subject. Try to read a little bit on the outside as well, because it helps you get new ideas. That's why if I see a footnote in a book, I try to another book, I get that book, and that book has footnotes in it, which take me to another book, and 3 or 4 books down, I find the one that really excites me. And then I see how can I apply that to my work. So I would recommend that. Yes?
I'm sorry, like more or less a practical question from my side. Like
Of
how
course.
do you know like how does it work with, for example, intellectual property? If I write the paper in my university, is it mine? Can I like suggest it or propose it to a journal, or is it like property of the university? Because I'm not quite sure, and I don't think like that we are like really how is it called, that we are familiar with those legal
I don't
side
know.
of the publishing.
It's a very good question. I don't know. I suspect that, excuse me, that the rules on copyright may be different from country to country. But usually, if you're doing research in a university as an employee, okay, and you get a patent, okay, there's a patent on something you develop, that patent will often belong to your employer, not to you. But as for a paper, when that paper is published in a journal, that's your paper with your name. And that's it, that's your paper. It doesn't belong to the university, it belongs to you.
So even my bachelor thesis reworked, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. That's yours.
Okay.
That's yours. As far as I know, unless the laws here are very different from every other country I know. And they could be, I don't know. But it's yours, because it's your work. And you weren't an employee, you were a student. That's different, I think, from being an employee. Anyone else? How are we doing? Well, it's almost...
And in case of
Yes?
employee, does it belong to the employer?
I think so.
Really?
I think so. At least in the US it does. So there have been a lot of cases in the US where somebody said, I invented it. And the company said, yes, but you invented it while working on company time, therefore it belongs to the company. And the company almost always wins.
Does it mean that the name of the boss, of the head of the company should be mentioned among the authors?
Oh, no. Not for a paper. not for a paper. I'm thinking of patents and inventions. Now, in the German-speaking countries, the professor's name goes on everybody's papers. It's really bizarre. So these professors have huge amounts of publications because every time one of their students gets published, their name goes on it and they get another publication. It's their theory is, but I help the student with the paper. But in Scandinavia, it's not like that at all. Okay, you write the paper. Whoever wrote the paper, that's the person on it. If the professor did a lot of work on it and helped them a lot, well then, if the professor really worked on it, then the professor's part of the paper. But otherwise, no. And everybody wants, at some point, a single author paper. In certain fields, you have multiple author papers a lot, like economics, because you've got the person doing the econometrics, and you've got the person doing something else, and you've got all these other aspects where you need specialists of various kinds. But everybody tries to get at least one single author paper, and the ones in the German-speaking countries go crazy because they can't get them. You know, and some professors insist that you're mine for the rest of your life. My name has to go on everything you publish or I'll sue you. And it's like, you know, you can't escape the famous professor. So, no, the head of the university doesn't go there because the head of the university didn't write the paper, didn't work on the paper, no. But you give the name of your university, and therefore when your paper gets cited and somebody looks at your paper and they see that you are at that university, then everybody's happy. Okay, because then the citation for that university goes up. All right?
Any more questions?
Anybody?
Can you speak of the, let's say, instead of citing texts, students take them from the internet, and how are there any recommendations how to reword the text when using it in the...
Well, when you say they take it from the internet, the paper's on the internet, or they just get information from the internet?
I think papers.
Well, papers are usually available online and everywhere. You should quote them. And if you don't quote them, you can say, so-and-so 2016 said blah, 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 and then you have to put it in their own words. You can put it in your own words and then you don't quote, but you still have to say they said this. Mm-hmm. You can't claim it's... In English, the minute you don't put a citation, the assumption is that you are saying this. Mm-hmm. So you have to be very careful about what you are saying and what somebody else is saying. And attribution is what it's called, is very, very important. You don't want to claim that some idea was yours that's from somebody else. That's considered very bad form. I remember the first time I worked in Russia when one of the students said, well, what about famous professors recycling papers? And I said, what? And I said, you mean they're quoting from their old papers? They have to cite that paper. No. They take their old papers, they give it a new title, they take it to a new journal, and it's the exact same paper, and now they have a new publication. And my eyes kept getting bigger and bigger. And I said, if they did that anywhere in Europe or the States or the UK, they'd be drummed out of the academic world. You can't do that. You know? But evidently, famous professors were doing it here. So I'm learning something new all the time. I just want to wish you all the best of luck. I think it's so I really feel bad for those of you who don't have access to the journals and the journal papers. And that, just as I said, try to find anybody, somebody who's got a friend, who's got a friend, who's got a friend at Guimau or at the Higher School of Economics, so that you can use their website to get hold of the papers you need. Someone at a university that I shall not mention in Russia said that a professor had gone to some university in the States as a visiting scholar for 2 months, 3 months, and spent every night and every weekend in the library with dozens of flash drives, downloading papers, downloading papers, downloading papers, copying papers to bring home for his students. Because that was the only way he could get them to them. And it just seemed so sad. So I really wish you luck that the universities will start investing and that you will get the help you need. And I hope that this talk today has been useful for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.